Gravity is an unproven theory made into an assumption and treated as a fact. The entirety of astrophysics begins with the assumption that gravity exists, then continues forward. It is in complete violation of sound scientific reasoning to bypass necessary verification of some aspect of science and regard it as fact. If we were to allow this violation of the necessity of proof required for gravity, science would immediately lose all its foundation of validity, because anything goes at that point. We can all acknowledge the fact that sometimes when we do our laundry, a sock comes up missing and is nowhere to be found. We don't have a sound explanation for this, so maybe we invent one. Gnomes. Let's now declare that because socks go missing, and we don't know why, that it is necessary enough proof that it must be gnomes taking our socks. Thenceforth, it becomes acceptable to claim it a fact that whenever a sock is missing from your load of laundry, that it was taken by gnomes, seeing that they're now real, even though we have never detected or seen said gnomes. Now the purpose of this text is to introduce you to alternative, valid reasons for why things fall, float, and rise, using only concepts that have been or can be observed or verified, centering around the concepts of relative density, and nowhere in this definition is there need or room for some ad hoc force called gravity. The example with the gnomes and missing socks sounds ridiculous, and is meant to, but this example follows strictly the guidelines set upon us if we allow non-proven assumptions to lead our physical sciences. To relate that back to gravity, one has to realize the same steps were followed in defining gravity. An apple drops, and Sir Isaac Newton didn't know why, and couldn't rationally explain why with the current verifiable scientific information, so he made up a force called gravity. Up until this current day, gravity has never been detected, proven, observed, or even consistently mechanically defined. Since its conception, the theory of gravity has been described in three distinct ways. First by Newton as an inherent property of all matter, making all matter attracted to all other matter. Then later by Einstein as the curvature of space-time. And then finally by quantum theorists as a result of hypothesized subatomic particles called gravitons. If gravity was actually an inherent property of all matter, just imagine if that were the case. Do you think if you threw a handful of marbles in space, that all the marbles would start orbiting each other and stick to one another? Do you think they would then begin orbiting around and sticking to you, the relatively much more massive object? So everything you throw out into space would eventually just come back like a boomerang? Really? Scientism apologists will say that gravity is too weak between objects of human-sized proportions to exhibit any noticeable attraction to one another. But if that's the case, then how were the initial molecules attracted to one another that then later formed the Earth? If there is no observable attraction between a baseball and a tennis ball, then what causes the original hydrogen and helium atoms to attract one another? Let's consider the second theory that gravity is actually a bend in space-time. This term, space-time, which Einstein created, claims that points in space are now defined as events, and time is now a fourth physical dimension existing alongside length, breadth, and thickness. As Einstein critic Gerard Hickson wrote in his book Kings Dethroned, while claiming time as a fourth dimension, Einstein explains that by dimension we must understand merely one of four independent quantities which locate an event in space. This is to imply that the other three dimensions which are in common use are independent quantities, which is not the case, for length, breadth, and thickness are essentially found in combination. They coexist in each and every physical thing, so that they are related. Hence, they are not independent quantities. On the contrary, time is an independent quantity. It is independent of any one or all the three proportions of material things. It is not in any way related, and therefore cannot be used as a fourth dimension. The third and latest definition of gravity comes from quantum theorists, who have created hypothesized subatomic particles that no one has ever seen called gravitons. In other words, they're passing it off onto the only field of science, quantum theory, where it is explicitly claimed that anything is possible, and which translates over to, We are now free to postulate anything we want beyond any logical structured field of science, and the guidelines that normally negate incorrect ideas about the universe are now lifted, making us exempt from scrutiny and rebuttal. Seriously, how do you already have a name for something you haven't even found yet? In short, gravity is simply nowhere to be found, and they're just trying to push its existence beyond the scope of any field of science, so we never arrive at the answer. And they do this because there is no answer, and as science progresses, it is forming concrete, demonstrative proof that gravity does not exist in the realms in which they claim it does, so therefore they have to push it just beyond our grasp every time we get close. That's the nature of their so-called proofs for gravity. They conceptualize it, name it, define physics around it, and then leave out the crucial step of discovering it. This is not science. It is science fiction. Discovery and demonstration in science are the most crucial factors, not ones that can be skipped or held off until a further time. Now I know what your smartass is saying. Yeah, it's been detected. Watch this pen drop. But in order for that to be factual, you have to prove against all other rationale the reason that pen drops is uniquely the act of gravity and nothing else. To make matters even worse on you, by definition of gravity, you have to prove how all matter attracts all other matter indefinitely, and how that concept is why the pen is falling towards the ground. Imagine an empty plastic balloon dropping to the ground because gravity pulled it. Now, let's add mass to that empty plastic balloon, thus increasing the force of gravity. But this mass we add is gaseous, helium. Now let's release this once dropping balloon with the added mass of helium, which increases the force of gravity, and what happens? The balloon goes up? If gravity is pulling everything down towards the Earth, including the empty plastic balloon, why should adding more mass in the form of helium to that balloon suddenly cause gravity to be completely negated, allowing the balloon to rise? There is no force in physics that would propel an object in one direction, and if you increase that force, it sends the object completely in the opposite direction. It's just a fact of nature. If X amount of forces push an object Y amount of feet, then increasing X will only increase Y in the same direction, assuming both X forces are also in the same direction. So if the force of gravity pulls the empty balloon down, then adding mass to the balloon only increases the force of gravity in the same direction, yet the balloon travels completely against gravity all the way up into the sky and requires no fuel or energy input to do so. If gravity is a downward acceleration, then why would anything move upwards? Mainstream science claims that the reason the balloon moves upwards is because of buoyancy, which is a result of the heavier, more dense air being pulled under the helium balloon, thus making the balloon rise up, right? But on the flip side, don't they claim that all objects of different masses fall at the same rate? So why would gravity pull air molecules down harder or faster than it would the helium balloon if objects of different masses all fall at the same rate? Quite simply, a helium balloon is not pulled to the ground, as there is no mythical pulling force, nor is there a downward directional bias. Everything seeks its relative density with the medium surrounding it, and that is all. A feather and an anvil will both fall at different rates because one is radically denser than the air, while the other is not. This debunks the supposed uniform speed of acceleration due to gravity, 9.8 meters per second squared, which would more accurately be labeled something like the maximum acceleration towards density equilibrium. As long as something has enough mass and is aerodynamic enough to negate the air resistance of the fall, objects will fall at the same rate of approximately 9.8 meters per second squared. When in a vacuum chamber, the factor of air resistance is removed completely, so everything, even feathers, balloons, and dandelion seeds, will fall at the same rate. So for example, a hammer and a feather have different masses, but fall at the same rate in a vacuum. This shows that mass is not the deciding factor of why things fall at the rate they do. This is shown to be true, because if you change the mass, the rate of descent is not affected. Now what they are falling through is the same medium, a vacuum. So let's change the medium and see if that changes the rate of descent. If we change the medium to air, the hammer very slightly changes its rate of descent, and the feather more drastically changes its rate. If we change the medium again to water, the hammer drastically changes its rate of descent, and the feather would begin floating. Therefore, the change in rate of descent of objects clearly has nothing to do with mass, and has everything to do with the object's relative density to the medium surrounding it. Objects of different masses fall at the same rate in a vacuum because they are falling through the same medium, and the rate in which they do so is dependent on their relative density compared to that of the medium. Gravity is said to attract all matter with mass towards all other matter with mass. Now, if gravity is strong enough to pull an empty balloon down, then it must be strong enough to pull even lighter, less massive things, for the simple fact that mass is the measure of resistance something has to forces. Since gravity is a monopole inward pulling force, and more massive objects are less affected by the momentum caused by it, then gravity should have no trouble pulling helium particles towards the center of the Earth. They should in fact be much less trouble than pulling the molecular chains comprising rubber elastic polymers that constitute a toy balloon. Therefore, there should never be any anti-gravitation motions by any matter, seeing as gravity is only pulling one way and uniformly across all molecules. Think of a flowing current in a river. Everything you throw in the current will either go in the direction of the current, approaching zero as the object gets more massive, but what you won't ever have is an object you throw in the current, and without any energy spent, it travels against the current, especially lighter or less dense objects. This anti-gravitational movement defies other known sound laws of physics, and only does so because they made a wrong assertion, and they fudge in gravity to piece together all the violations of other known laws of physics that don't allow for such illogical motions or phenomena. Rather than contriving this counterintuitive nonsense they call gravity, let's look at the world as if it's a flat plane going on infinitely up and infinitely down. If one is to assume the universe is infinite, then it is not in violation of any action against infinite properties to say that an infinite universe means there's an infinite amount of matter, and to arrange this infinite matter to form what we observe to be our reality, which is that there is a density gradient in which we exist, where all matter below us is more dense, and all matter above us is less dense. Now, rather than assume the existence of having a gaseous atmosphere hovering around a ball in a vacuum, which violates many laws of physics, instead, imagine we live on an infinite plane with a density gradient. Solid matter forms the land below us, less dense matter forms the fluids on top of that, and even less dense matter forms the gaseous atmosphere we have above the solid surface. Now, it's not to say that space is a vacuum, but rather, as we climb further up the density gradient, eventually we reach a point where any particle is more dense than the lack thereof any particles, or the void. Since the void is less dense than any gaseous particle, or any particle at all, it supersedes any particle, and thus arranges itself above the particle atmosphere. Space, in this instance, would not be a vacuum, but rather a gradual taper in density up to the point of there only being a void. And this void, since the universe is assumed infinite, goes on forever, simply for the fact that any particle would be sunk down below it. Also, I made the mistake of saying that gaseous particles are the least dense form of matter, when in fact highly charged plasmas are actually the least dense form of matter. And seeing that these plasmas have an excited and high energy level, that, along with the fact that heat rises, as well as less dense matter rises, you then have scattered bodies of radiant plasmas in the skies, much further than the gaseous atmospheric band of gas molecules. And these plasmic luminaries exist in an environment of such little friction that they themselves move about at such immense velocities whereas to create the stellar motions. Now one should take into account that plasmic matter also forms magnetic qualities, either positively or negatively charged, or both at dipoles, so much so as to cause these objects to spin individually and also rotate collectively around the central northern magnetic pole in the center of the flat Earth plane. So none of this proposed violates any known laws of physics and offers no contradictions as to its mechanics and function. which is more than can be said about the ludicrous ball-earth model, which is cram-packed with violations, fallacies, and incoherence of known physical laws. To think that the reason you are pressed to the ground is because the ground is constantly pulling you down is as flawed as saying a helium balloon rises because the ceiling is pulling it up. Clearly, in this example, it is not the ceiling of the auditorium pulling the balloon to it, because if you remove the ceiling, the balloon still rises, having nothing to do with the ceiling. So if this is true, and is proven to be so, then one can conclude that the reason we are pressed to the ground has nothing to do with the ground, but rather that the ground is just a barrier in the way of our trajectory down the density gradient. As anyone can test for themselves, as you remove the ground from under you, you continue to fall downward until you're met with more solid barrier matter. So if we were to remove the ground completely, we would descend down the density gradient until we reach the point of density equilibrium in which we would float freely amongst other similarly dense matter. And once this point is reached, particles can float about freely in whatever direction they want. Hence why air molecules, being in their density equilibrium point, neither fall nor rise, but rather flow about freely moving whichever way the wind blows them. Now as humans have a density equilibrium point a little above water, and hence why we fall through the gaseous atmosphere but float up in water, and coincidentally while in water, we can move about in all three-dimensional directions, something we can't do in air, and this lines up perfectly with the scientific notion that we are upwards of 70% water, which would mean that the remaining 30% of us that isn't water is comprised of matter less dense than water, and hence why we float in it. And although some of that matter, like bone matter, is more dense, other parts, like the air in our lungs, and therefore all throughout our bloodstream, average out the remaining 30% of non-water matter. Now, one must realize that it takes no energy to remain afloat on water, like when doing a back float, but it takes much energy for birds, for instance, to stay airborne in the air, because they are not at their density equilibrium point when flying. In conclusion, let's consider the following proven facts of physics versus the supposed effects of gravity. It is a fact that objects set in motion in a straight line in a frictionless environment continue to move in a straight line, while objects at rest remain at rest. Unless gravity exists, then whatever object launched the original object into motion would cause the object moving in a straight line to eventually slow down, stop, and start heading back towards the launching mechanism. It is a fact that a spinning tethered object, once the tether is broken, immediately starts traveling in a straight line tangent to the circle it was rotating around. Unless gravity exists, then objects will just continue to orbit with or without the tether, as they claim the sun and planets do. It is a fact that any non-adhered substance or object on the outer surface of a spinning object will fly off from the equatorial line of rotation. Unless gravity exists, then everything just perfectly sticks to spinning objects without there being the slightest outward push from the spin or inward pull from gravity. It is supposedly a fact of gravity that objects of different masses all fall at the same rate. Unless you have a helium balloon handy, in which case it won't fall at all and will rise upwards instead. It is supposedly a fact of gravity that two objects of appropriate mass will orbit each other based solely on their relative mass to one another. Unless you require an actual demonstration, an empirical scientific experiment showing it, in which case it has never been done. And the questions continue. How or why would huge solid planets orbit around a giant flaming ball of gas? What is orbit, and why is it never observed, but is the reason why the Earth goes around the Sun? And the Moon around the Earth, but nothing on any smaller scale ever orbits. Why would water stick to the outside of a convex surface? How do we stick to the outside of a ball that's spinning and orbiting 32 times faster than a bullet? How does an object spin forever without ever succumbing to friction? How does the Earth propel itself to remain in constant motion around the Sun without any fuel or burning any energy to sustain such immense velocities? How does the Moon go around the Earth with no energy required at such a grueling pace? How does any of this take place without any form of energy consumption to maintain these outlandish motions and velocities? All of these questions present problems that the theory of gravity simply cannot explain. Can you see how many facts of physics gravity just brushes by the wayside? But we do believe that we have an explanation. You know how beyond 10 miles out to sea, the laws of the land no longer apply, because you are no longer in any national jurisdiction? Well, that is 10 miles horizontally. What most people don't know is that if you travel 10 miles vertically, you are no longer subject to the laws of physics, because you're no longer in any academic jurisdiction.